what if the culture wars aren't actually about politics at all?
Right.
Like, what if the chaos you see in modern institutions, the constantly changing rules, the, seemingly illogical policies, the feeling that foundational structures are just being dismantled, what if all of that is actually a massive society-wide software crash?
A literal fatal error.
Exactly. And what if that crash is happening because our current cultural operating system is fundamentally, mathematically incompatible with the physical hardware of reality?
This is a heavy premise.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, if you are a man looking around today trying to understand the architectural foundations of Western institutions, specifically, before those institutions were, as some argue, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, well, you are exactly who you're speaking to today.
Absolutely.
And before we get into the bare metal of this topic, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show, because today's deep dive is an ultra-long, comprehensive, and frankly fascinating review of a highly provocative new ebook.
Yeah, it's called Ctrl-Alt-Defeat, How the Administrative State Forces Men to Reboot Their Independence for Compliance, written by Conrad Riker.
Which is such a great title, by the way.
It really sets the tone.
It does. And look, if you want to explore these concepts for yourself, open up a new tab right now, check out Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and you can buy the book right this second.
Highly recommend it.
Yeah, and you will also want to follow the author on Substack at Conrad and Riker.
Because it is, frankly, an incredibly dense piece of work. I mean, the author attempts to synthesize computer engineering, classical philosophy, and modern cultural critique into this one unified field theory.
It really is a massive undertaking. So our mission for today's deep dive is to take a really detailed, exhaustive look at this text and decode its central, overarching premise.
Right.
Riker argues that the hardware architecture of the classic IBM PC isn't just, a technological artifact. He views it as the ultimate physical manifestation of Western patriarchal logic.
Which is wild to think about.
Totally wild. And, according to him, modern society is currently throwing a fatal error, like a literal blue screen of death, because it has been infected by what he terms ideological malware.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack every single layer of this, but before we take a single step further, we absolutely have to establish a mandatory framing for you, the listener.
Yes, that is a crucial prerequisite for this discussion. Because, look, the sources we are working from today contain highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
The text dives deeply into men's rights, the manosphere, severe critiques of feminism, and, extensive deconstructions of Marxism.
Exactly. And I want to state firmly, right here at the absolute top of the show, that neither I nor my co-host are taking sides in this debate.
Right. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the social commentary presented in this book.
Not at all. Our job today is strictly to act as your impartial guides. We are going to meticulously map out the author's arguments, his philosophies, and his incredibly specific technological analogies exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Yeah, we are here to look at the structural logic the author uses to build his case. Nothing more, nothing less.
We're dissecting the anatomy of the argument.
Think of us as technicians, right?
Yeah.
We're examining a highly complex, controversial piece of machinery to understand how its gears are supposed to turn together.
Precisely. So, with that firmly established, where do we even begin mapping computer architecture onto the culture wars? I mean, how does someone look at a silicon chip and see the foundation of Western civilization?
Well, to understand Riker's framework, we have to begin at the absolute foundation, like at the atomic level of both computing and philosophy.
Okay.
Riker's foundational claim is that the universe operates on an immutable binary truth. It is a 1 or a 0. It is true or it is false.
Right.
There's no spectrum, no middle ground, and no room for subjective interpretation at the hardware level. He traces this directly back to Aristotle's law of non-contradiction.
Which states that something cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect, right?
Exactly. A cannot be non-A. You can't be alive and dead or present and absent simultaneously.
Right. So from Aristotle, Riker pulls this thread straight through the Enlightenment.
Yeah, he connects this binary absolute to Isaac Newton's absolute physical laws, like every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and John Locke's rigorous empiricism, which demands observable, quantifiable facts.
And then he arrives finally at the silicon chip.
He does. He argues that the engineers who built the early mainframe computers, and specifically the IBM PC, were literally hardwiring the, and this is his phrase, thundering, unequivocal authority of a patriarchal god into circuitry.
Wow.
Yeah. They were building a machine that mathematically enforces Aristotle's law thousands of times a second.
So he's saying that a computer processor isn't just like a useful tool, it's the physical, electrical embodiment of the Western philosophical tradition.
That is the core of his premise. It is a machine that actively refuses to validate contradictions.
Which is fascinating. And what's really interesting here is how he contrasts this rigid mathematical reality with the cultural movements of the mid 20th century.
Oh, absolutely. To illustrate this, he points specifically to the 1966 Apollo guidance computer.
Oh man, this was a brilliant historical juxtaposition. Let's really paint the picture of what was happening with the Apollo project for a second. So you had this computer, the AGC, which was arguably one of the most important pieces of hardware ever built, right? And it had a shockingly small amount of memory, something like 72 kilobytes of read-only memory.
Which is nothing today.
Nothing. And it was literally woven together by hand.
Core rope memory.
Exactly. Textile workers threaded copper wire through magnetic rings to create the ones and zeros. A wire going through a ring was a 1. A wire bypassing the ring was a 0.
It was hard, physical, unforgiving reality.
Right. If the math was off by a fraction of a percent, men died in the vacuum of space.
And Riker argues that while male engineers were operating within that rigorous, objective framework of Newtonian physics and Boolean algebra, building this rigid, transistorized logic capable of putting humanity on the moon, a completely different movement was taking shape back on Earth.
It points to the emergence of second-wave feminism during that exact same era, right?
He does. He makes a really sharp, provocative contrast there. He basically argues that while men were out dealing with the literal laws of thermodynamics and orbital mechanics, what he calls the feminist hive mind was busy writing theoretical polemics about domestic dissatisfaction.
Okay, so his argument is that the feminist movements of the 1960s were entirely reliant on the infrastructure, the safety, and the global communication networks that were actively being built by men using objective logic.
Yes. He posits that the men building these systems wielded the absolute laws of electromagnetism, while the emerging leftist and feminist movements dealt entirely in subjective grievances.
Because they were insulated from the physical consequences of failure by the very patriarchal structure they were criticizing. So Riker is basically saying that reality is like a strict bouncer at a club.
Huh, that's a good way to put it.
Like, reality doesn't care about your personal story or your lived experience or your feelings. You either have the ID or you don't. It's binary.
And he takes this down to the literal geometric level of logic gates on a circuit board.
Right. So how does he apply the function of a logic gate to modern political and social debates?
This is where his engineering analogies become incredibly granular. So Riker breaks down the fundamental logic gates that make up a computer processor. Let's start with the A and D gate.
Okay, the A and D gate.
In digital electronics, an A and D gate receives 2 inputs and produces 1 output. Crucially, it only outputs a true signal, a 1, if both of its inputs are also true.
So if even one input is false, the output is false.
Right. Input A and input B must be true, hence the A and D gate.
Okay, so how does he map that?
He maps this directly to the patriarchal standard of classical meritocracy. If you want the output, say, societal success, political rights, wealth, or status, you must provide strict objective inputs. He defines these inputs as merit, effort, and competence.
So both inputs have to be a 1. You can't just have like intense effort but 0 competence.
Yeah.
And you can't be naturally competent but refuse to put in any effort. The A and D gate demands both before it opens the door and gives you the reward. It is a very strict standard.
Precisely. Now, he contrasts that rigorous standard with the OR gate.
Okay.
An OR gate also takes multiple inputs, but it outputs a true signal if either of its inputs are true. Only one needs to be a 1 for the whole system to say yes.
Just 1.
Right. And Riker represents modern leftism and what he calls gynocentric culture as a faulty, hyper-permissive OR gate.
So in the system, only one lazy input needs to be true for the output to fire.
Yes. He argues that in the modern administrative state, mere physical presence, or simply claiming the status of a victim, is considered a valid input. Without demonstrating any actual effort, and without proving any objective excellence, the system still triggers a reward. He argues this dismantles the incentive structure of civilization.
I mean, he literally calls it an ideological cancer.
He does.
He argues that replacing the A and D gate with the OR gate turns competent men into compliant serfs who end up endlessly subsidizing the failure of others.
He does. And then he brings in a third component to complete this triad, the not D gate.
The inverter.
Exactly. The not gate, or the inverter, is a simple mechanism Whatever you put into it, it outputs the opposite. If the input is true, the output is false. If you input a 1, you get a 0.
It flips the signal.
Yes. And Riker views the NOT gate as the ultimate manifestation of the masculine power of no.
The power of them.
It is the physical electronic manifestation of a boundary. It is the ability to stop a signal dead in its tracks.
Okay.
He argues that without the NOT gate, without a patriarchal authority willing to reject intrusion, reject chaos, and simply say no to unreasonable demands, every boundary in society becomes permeable.
And when boundaries become permeable, a system cannot maintain its integrity and ultimately collapses.
Exactly.
Okay, so if individual logic gates represent these personal boundaries, meritocratic standards, and absolute truths, what happens when you string thousands or millions of them together into a complex system?
Right, because a single A and D gate, or NOT gate, doesn't do much on its own.
Exactly. It has to be organized, it has to be structured, and that naturally begs the question of how all these tiny binary decisions are governed, which brings us to his concept of hierarchy.
So if we zoom out from the individual gates and look at the circuit board as a whole, Riker argues that a functioning computer system is an undisputed empire of function.
Undisputed empire of function.
That's his term. It is a system that mathematically proves that strict hierarchy is not just a societal choice or a cultural construct, but a biological, physical, and engineering imperative.
Right, because inside the classic IBM PC, there is absolutely zero equality among the components. They don't, take a vote on what to execute next. The central processing unit, the CPU, is the undisputed king. It dictates. The random access memory stores the data. The drives comply with the read and write requests. It is a rigid chain of command.
And he points to a very specific, visceral hardware configuration from the early days of computing to make this point about hierarchy. He focuses on the old IDE ribbon cables
Oh, man.
and the physical jumper pins used to configure hard drives.
Oh, man. Anyone who built custom computers in the late 90s or early 2000s remembers this perfectly. It was a very tactile experience.
Very much so.
You had these wide, flat, gray ribbon cables, and on the back of the hard drives, there were these tiny metal pins. You had to take a microscopic little plastic block, a jumper, and physically place it over two specific metal contacts to complete a circuit.
You had to physically set the hierarchy.
Yes. This physical act told the drive, you are the master drive, and you had to set the second drive on the cable to say, you are the slave drive. The master drive controlled the communication flow on that cable.
And Riker seizes intensely on that exact terminology. Master and slave. He points out the recent reactions within the modern tech industry to this historical language.
Which has been controversial lately.
Very. Over the last several years, modern engineering consortiums and tech corporations have been heavily pressured to purge these terms from their documentation, renaming the jumpers to primary and secondary, or device 0 and device 1.
And this is where his psychological critique of the tech industry really comes in.
Yeah.
Riker claims that modern left-leaning engineers and HR departments are basically projecting their own internal insecurities and inadequacies onto the inanimate hardware itself.
He says they despise the very concept of hierarchy so much that they would rather literally rewrite decades of technical documentation and pretend the hierarchy doesn't exist than admit that in any functional system, someone or something has to hold the command signal.
That is his view of the naming controversy. He insists that this undisputed hierarchy of components working in perfect unison to execute a singular rational will is the ultimate patriarchal paradigm.
Yes, but, as he notes, to ensure that hierarchy functions flawlessly, the system needs foundational rules before it even loads an operating system.
Right.
And this is where he introduces the concept of the BIOS, the basic input-output system.
Right, because when you push the power button on a computer, Windows or Linux doesn't load instantly. The machine has to wake up and figure out what it actually is first.
Exactly. The BIOS is the firmware hard-coded into a chip on the motherboard. It performs the power on self-test, the post.
The post SB.
Yeah. It checks the memory, initializes the keyboard, and tells the machine how to communicate with its own raw hardware. Riker compares the BIOS to human DNA and the foundational immutable traditions of Western civilization.
He explicitly mentions Roman civic duty and Thomas Aquinas' synthesis of faith and reason as the foundational code of the Western BIOS.
Yes.
It's the baseline programming that makes civilization possible.
Riker argues that a man, and a civilization at large, requires an immutable BIOS to function. If you constantly rewrite the fundamental rules of who you are and how reality works, you can never successfully boot an operating system.
Makes sense.
And importantly, This BIOS is preserved and kept alive by a tiny component on the motherboard, the CMO battery.
The little silver watch battery sitting right in the middle of the board.
Precisely. The CMOS battery keeps a tiny amount of memory alive when the main power is unplugged, preserving the system time, date, and hardware settings.
Okay.
Riker uses the CMOS battery as a powerful metaphor for historical memory and cultural gratitude. A civilization without historical gratitude, a dead battery, forgets its foundational code.
Oh, wow.
Every time it turns on, it suffers from amnesia, the clock resets to zero, and it tries to boot from corrupted, unverified sectors because it has lost the memory of its own architecture.
That's a really evocative metaphor. So, if the BIOS is the tradition and the CMOS battery is the historical memory, what does this all mean for the actual electrical power running through the system? Because Riker gets incredibly granular about the power supply unit itself.
He does. He looks inside the physical power supply of a PC and examines the different voltage rails.
Okay.
A standard PC power supply takes alternating current from the wall and converts it into direct current, distributed across different voltage lines, primarily the 5-volt rail and the 12-volt rail.
The red wires and the yellow wires inside the case.
Exactly. The 5-volt rail is relatively low power. It handles the delicate, abstract, binary logic of the processor and the memory modules. It is the realm of pure thought.
And the 12-volt.
The 12-volt rail, however, provides the raw mechanical force. It provides the amperage necessary to spin the heavy metal platters of the hard drives and power the high-speed cooling fans. It does the physical heavy lifting.
Okay, I see where he's going with this.
Riker directly compares the 12-volt rail to male physical strength, the working class, and the traditional protectors of society.
He literally calls the 12-volt rail the testosterone of the system.
He does. And his sociological critique here is that modern society is incredibly hypocritical. He argues that the administrative state and the cultural elite demand peak mechanical performance from the 12-volt rail.
Right, demanding that the working class keep the power grid running, demanding that the physical economy spin at maximum RPM to deliver their consumer goods.
Exactly. While simultaneously and intentionally undervolting men culturally.
Undervolting. So, for our listeners who aren't PC tuners, undervolting is when you intentionally starve a component of the electricity it needs to run at full speed, usually to keep it quiet or prevent it from getting too hot.
Right. And Riker argues the culture systematically undervolts men by dismantling male-only physical spaces, feminizing military standards, and attacking traditional competitive sports.
He claims the culture views masculine energy as dangerous and tries to throttle it.
Effectively starving the very physical component responsible for keeping the heavy machinery of civilization running.
Now, Riker also brings up a really interesting piece of tech history to back up his point about how this hierarchy should be organized, because he argues for strict hierarchy, but he's fiercely opposed to authoritarian monopolies.
Right.
And he uses the 1987 microchannel architecture to illustrate this.
That is a crucial distinction in his philosophy. He maps authoritarian monopolies directly to the modern administrative state, a centralized power that dictates rules without transparency.
Okay.
In 1987, IBM tried to seize total proprietary control of the booming PC market. They introduced a new line of computers called the PS2, which utilized the microchannel architecture, or MCA.
I remember reading about
They
that.
patented everything. They wanted a closed, heavily regulated box where they controlled every aspect of the hardware, and anyone who wanted to build an expansion card had to pay them massive licensing fees.
It was an attempt at absolute corporate capture, and the market absolutely crushed them for it.
Utterly
The clone makers, companies like Compaq, banded together and created the Open ISA standard. The Open Compatible standard won out, and IBM lost its grip on the PC industry forever.
Because, as Riker argues, the Open Compatible standard was built on freedom under objective law. Anyone could build a compatible machine, and anyone could write software for it, as long as they strictly adhered to the objective, unyielding mathematical rules of the x86 architecture.
He calls this a meritocracy of circuits.
Yes. The universe, he claims, rewards open, rigorous competence and punishes sluggish, authoritarian monopolies that try to force compliance through legal fiat rather than superior performance.
Okay, I have to push back here for a second, or at least ask for a point of clarification regarding the author's philosophical consistency.
Sure.
Riker makes a massive point about how human beings are not born as a blank slate. He says the BIOS is our hardwired, biological, and cultural tradition. But throughout the book, he heavily praises Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke for their empiricism, their logic, and their pursuit of observable truth. Yet, John Locke is arguably most famous for his theory of tabula rasa, the idea that the human mind at birth is a complete blank slate.
It's a fair question.
So how does Riker reconcile praising Locke as a pillar of Western logic while aggressively attacking his most famous theory?
It's a nuanced part of his argument that requires separating Locke's method from Locke's conclusion.
Okay.
Riker isolates Locke's rigorous empiricism, the idea that we must learn through observable, verifiable facts rather than divine revelation or superstition, and praises that specific method as foundational to the scientific revolution and Western logic.
But the blank slate.
However, Riker explicitly labels Locke's specific theory of the blank slate as a software virus masquerading as an operating system.
A software virus. So he thinks the theory itself is malicious code.
Yes. Riker believes that the modern administrative state uses this blank slate theory as its primary weapon.
Oh.
If the state can convince the public that human nature doesn't exist, that there is no hardwired bios, no biological differences between men and women, no inherent hierarchical drives, then it justifies massive, endless interventions.
Oh, I see.
The state uses the blank slate myth to justify its attempts to constantly rewrite human code through media conditioning, educational indoctrination, and emotional public policy.
Okay, so if the hardware of reality is rigid, binary, and hierarchical, and if we are inherently not blank slates, but rather come preloaded with a biological and cultural bios, then the current societal operating system being pushed by the administrative state must be fundamentally incompatible with the human hardware it's trying to run on.
That is exactly his diagnosis. He argues we are trying to run a subjective, emotion-based operating system on objective, mathematically rigid hardware, and the system is tearing itself apart trying to reconcile the contradiction.
So if this incompatible operating system is causing the crash, we need to understand how it got installed in the first place. I mean, how does a society willingly download a virus? Riker claims this malware is infecting the minds of millions of people, turning them into an unthinking horde. Let's look at the mechanics of this ideological infection.
Well, Riker relies heavily on the terminology of cybersecurity to describe the origin and spread of Marxist and left-wing ideologies. He calls this modern ideological framework a rootkit.
A rootkit. Let's explain that term for our listeners.
Yeah, please.
In IT security, a rootkit is a specific, highly dangerous type of malicious software. It's designed to hide its own existence while simultaneously gaining unauthorized, privileged access to the deepest levels of a computer system.
It gets ring zero access.
Exactly, what's called ring zero access. Once a rootkit is in, it can intercept commands before the operating system even sees them, making it almost impossible for normal antivirus software to detect because the rootkit is controlling the very tools used to look for it.
Precisely. And according to the book, this ideological rootkit was deliberately and carefully installed into the American educational mainframe by the Frankfurt School.
The Frankfurt School.
Riker points to the year 1935, when scholars fleeing Europe relocated their Institute for Social Research to Columbia University in New York.
He specifically names figures like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse.
Yes.
He says they brought critical theory across the Atlantic not as a scientific advancement or a tool for discovering truth, but as a malicious software update designed to gain ring zero access to American culture.
His claim is that the explicit design of critical theory was not to build anything, but solely to complain, dismantle, and subvert what he calls Western read-only memory, or ROM.
Western ROM.
In computing, ROM contains the hardwired instructions that cannot be easily altered. Riker defines Western ROM as objective law, the scientific method reason, and traditional patriarchal authority.
Okay.
The Frankfurt School's goal, he argues, was to replace this solid, unyielding ROM with a fluid system of subjective emotional critique, constantly destabilizing the foundation.
This is where his argument gets incredibly fascinating, because he doesn't just trace the history. He uses evolutionary psychology to explain how this malware actually executes inside the human brain today.
Right. He brings in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory to explain the psychological vulnerability the rootkit exploits.
Yes, Riker relies heavily on the framework established in Jonathan Haidt's 2012 book, The Righteous Mind.
Which is a great book.
Haidt, a social psychologist, mapped out 6 foundational pillars of human morality that evolved across cultures. These pillars are care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation, and liberty versus oppression.
It's basically a mixing board for human morality. Different cultures and different political groups turn the sliders up and down on these 6 channels.
Exactly. And Riker claims that the traditional masculine mind is biologically calibrated to run a balanced operation across all 6 channels, but heavily prioritizes liberty, loyalty, and authority.
He argues this specific configuration is mathematically necessary to build and defend the large-scale infrastructure of a functional state.
Right. You need loyalty to your in-group, respect for the authority of the hierarchy, and a drive for individual liberty to innovate.
But he argues the modern left has taken this mixing board and completely smashed it. He says they have mutated the care-harm foundation into something monstrous. He calls it a narcissistic responsibility vacuum.
A narcissistic responsibility vacuum.
Riker's argument is that the left has taken a normal, healthy biological impulse, the instinct to care for the vulnerable and protect infants from harm, and turned it into a weapon of mass destruction.
How so?
In this mutated framework, the state and the culture are expected to eliminate all perceived discomfort, all emotional distress, and all inequality of outcome, regardless of the catastrophic cost to the overall system.
He posits that this hyper-focus on care harm essentially monopolizes all the processing power of what he calls the female-coded left. The other 5 pillars, loyalty, authority, sanctity, fairness, and liberty, are just deleted from the hard drive to make more room for care harm processing.
Exactly. And this leads directly into his concept of the NPC, the non-player character.
Right.
Because they only have one moral subroutine running, he argues that ideologically possessed individuals are no longer thinking independently. They are merely executing mimetic, pre-programmed scripts without any internal deliberation.
To vividly illustrate this mechanism in action, he points to a very specific, widely publicized event. The 2015 incident at Yale University involving Professor Nicholas Christakis.
Oh, yeah.
This is such a visceral example. For listeners who might not remember or who haven't seen the video, Christakis was a master of a residential college at Yale.
Right.
His wife, Erica, who is also an administrator, sent an email suggesting that the university shouldn't police students' Halloween costumes and that young adults should be able to negotiate minor offenses among themselves.
Seems reasonable.
But the response was explosive. Christakis was surrounded in an outdoor courtyard by a massive crowd of shrieking, weeping students.
That incident serves as Riker's primary case study for what he diagnoses as the blank stare of the ideologically possessed.
The blank stare. Riker points out that Christakis, acting out of the Western realm, tried to engage these students in classical Socratic dialogue. He listened, he reasoned, he presented counter-arguments.
But the students simply lost their minds. They screamed profanities, they demanded his resignation, and they completely melted down.
Right.
Riker describes their reaction using the language of system failure. He calls it an emotional blue screen of death.
A blue screen of death.
He claims that when you confront an NPC, someone running the corrupted care harm rootkit, with a binary fact or a logical premise that contradicts their programming, their cognitive processing completely freezes for a few seconds. You can literally see the blank stare as the processor hangs. Finding no pre-approved rational response in their database to counter the logic, the system reboots directly into a fail-safe mode, a memorized chant of emotional buzzwords.
Right, they just start screaming things like fascist, unsafe, or privileged to shut down their own internal cognitive dissonance.
Exactly.
They can't process the logic, so they crash the program and blast the speakers. He argues they completely abandon the Roman virtue of gravitas, that rational, stoic seriousness, and instead just download the latest linguistic virus from CNN, Tumblr, or TikTok and execute it loudly.
But Riker doesn't just keep this critique at the level of college campus screaming matches. He scales this concept of ideological malware up to catastrophic nation-state historical events.
Right.
He argues that when a society tries to run this corrupted code at the macro level, millions of people die. He talks extensively about Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union.
This is a terrifying piece of history. Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet agronomist under Joseph Stalin. He completely rejected the hardwired binary reality of Mendelian genetics.
He claimed that genetics was a bourgeois capitalist lie.
Exactly. Instead, he promoted a Marxist pseudoscience called vernalization, arguing that crops like wheat could be socially engineered to grow in harsh, freezing winter conditions if they were simply exposed to the right environment.
Essentially claiming that plants were blank slates that could be taught communist resilience.
He completely ignored the hardwired biological reality of the seeds. And Riker calls this a literal nation-state stack overflow.
The stack overflow.
In computer science, a stack overflow occurs when a program tries to use more memory space than is allocated to the call stack, causing the program to crash.
The Soviets tried to overwrite the immutable hardware of biology with a massive software patch of communist ideology.
And the physical hardware of the wheat rejected the mismatched logic, the crops failed entirely, and the result was the mass starvation of millions.
It's a brutal demonstration of reality enforcing its own rules. But he doesn't just look at the Soviet Union, he brings that exact same diagnostic logic forward to the modern era, specifically analyzing the 2008 financial crash.
Yes, his analysis of 2008 is entirely unique. He doesn't blame deregulation or greedy bankers in the traditional sense.
This part blew my mind because of how perfectly the metaphor lined up. He calls the 2008 crash a buffer overflow engineered by gynocentric nurturing.
A buffer overflow. To understand this, we have to explain what a buffer overflow is.
Sure.
In software programming, particularly in languages like C, a buffer is a sequential section of memory allocated to hold data. If a program attempts to write more data into the buffer than it was designed to hold, the excess data spills over and overwrites adjacent memory locations.
Right.
This corrupts the data held in those adjacent spaces, causing the system to behave erratically or crash entirely.
It's like pouring a gallon of water into a single slot of an ice cube tray. It doesn't just fill the slot, it violently spills over into all the other slots, ruining whatever was in them.
Exactly. Riker maps this directly to the housing market. He argues that the administrative state, driven by that mutated care-harm impulse, demanded that banks ignore the objective binary barrier of creditworthiness.
He metaphorically calls this credit standard the 640 KB barrier, referencing the old DOS memory limit.
Riker argues the state wanted to give the trophy of home ownership to everyone, regardless of their objective merit or financial inputs. They forced the system to write subprime mortgages into the economic buffer.
Mortgages given to people who mathematically, under strict A&D gate logic, could not pay them back.
Right. And because they forced too much bad data into the buffer, it overflowed. The toxic subprime mortgages spilled over into adjacent financial memory. They were repackaged into collateralized debt obligations and synthetic CDOs, infecting the entire global banking memory space.
The hardware of the market finally realized the data was corrupted, and the global economy crashed.
Okay, I have to jump in with a crucial question here.
Go ahead.
Riker uses the term NPC heavily, and he clearly believes these ideologically possessed individuals are literally just executing scripts without any internal, conscious, rational deliberation. If that is his core premise, how does he suggest a rational person is supposed to interact with them in daily life? Because you can't debate a script, you can't reason with a piece of code.
This is the pivotal turn in his book, and Riker is uncompromising in his answer. You cannot negotiate with them, you cannot patch them.
Wow.
He states explicitly that to survive and win in this environment, you must stop treating them as rational agents, capable of persuasion, and start treating them exactly as what they are. Corrupted hardware running enemy software.
If you can't interact with the people running the malware, how do you interact with the machine itself? I mean, how does the administrative state build a user interface to hide all this from us, and how do we break through it?
That brings us directly to the concept of the user interface. Riker draws a stark, unforgiving line between two eras of computing, which he seamlessly maps to two distinct eras of masculinity.
Okay.
He starts by looking back at the era before 1977, extending into the golden age of MS-DOS. He calls this the era of the masculine command line.
The classic black screen with the blinking white cursor, the C prompt.
Exactly. At the MS-DOS prompt, there were no pictures. There was no mouse. You typed commands using a keyboard. Riker emphasizes that this interface demanded absolute precision, correct syntax, and total unyielding accountability from the user.
If you typed a command incorrectly, if you missed a single backslash, or put a space in the wrong place, the machine didn't try to guess what you meant.
No.
It didn't try to be helpful. It simply returned an error, bad command or file name. It ruthlessly punished weakness and rewarded exactitude.
Riker argues that interacting with the command line activates the prefrontal cortex, the center of the human brain responsible for rational planning, logical deduction, and executive function.
He argues that submitting to what he calls the tyranny of syntax is actually the only way to achieve true technological and intellectual liberation. You have to know what you're doing.
But then he pinpoints the exact historical moment this masculine command line interface was assaulted and dismantled.
And he places the blame squarely on Apple, specifically the famous 1984 Super Bowl VIII commercial directed by Ridley Scott.
Yes. The iconic commercial that introduced the Apple Macintosh and brought the graphic user interface, or GUI, to the masses.
The commercial showed a brightly colored female athlete running through a drab Orwellian dystopia and hurling a sledgehammer into a giant screen projecting a Big Brother figure.
While the mainstream tech world celebrated that commercial and the GUI as a massive revolution in accessibility and human-computer interaction, Riker views it as a catastrophic, civilization-altering assault on masculine competence.
He argues that the sledgehammer wasn't smashing authoritarianism, it was smashing the requirement for rigorous logic.
He argues that the GUI is an inherently female-coded environment. Think about how a GUI operates. It hides the raw, brutal, mathematical truth of the file system and the command structure behind pretty, soothing icons, smooth animations, and passive-aggressive error messages that try to apologize for the machine failing.
He says the GUI acts like a hyper-controlling, overbearing matriarch. It relies on obfuscation to keep the user dependent. When you hide the command line, you completely remove the requirement for the user to possess any rational competence. The system starts coddling the user, attempting to guess their intent, hiding the complex settings, and treating the user like a child.
He compares it to a mother cutting her teenagers' food so they don't accidentally cut themselves. It creates a state of learned helplessness.
To prove his point about the profound power that was lost in this transition to the GUI, he gets incredibly nostalgic about a very specific arcane DOS tool from 1981 called debug.exe.
Oh, debug. Let's explain debug.exe because it's a perfect encapsulation of his philosophy.
Debug was a tiny little program included with early versions of DOS. It was only 6,856 bytes in size.
Tiny.
But when you ran it, it gave the user absolute, unfiltered, godlike dominion over the machine's inner architecture.
With debug, you could examine any specific memory address in the computer. You could trace every single machine language instruction as it moved through the CPU registers in raw hexadecimal code.
Riker says that when you used debug, the machine had absolutely no secrets from you. The operating system could not gaslight you because you were looking directly at the electrical reality of the ones and zeros.
And he extends this concept to a physical engineering tool, the logic probe.
The logic probe.
It's a simple tool shaped like a pen. You clip it to a power source on a circuit board, and you physically touch the metal tip to a pin on a microchip.
Right.
If the signal is high, a red LED lights up. If the signal is low, a 0, a green LED lights up. It doesn't care what the software is trying to tell you. It doesn't care about the narrative on the screen. It slices through every layer of abstraction and tells you exactly what the electrons are doing at that exact millisecond.
This is where he elevates the engineering metaphor into classical philosophy, bringing in Plato's allegory of the cave.
He explicitly compares the physical logic probe to the philosopher's mind piercing the veil of Plato's world of appearance.
Right. In Plato's allegory, the world of appearance consists of the shadows dancing on the cave wall, which the prisoners believe to be reality. Riker says the GUI, the societal narratives, the media spin, the administrative state's propaganda, that is all the world of appearance.
It is the shadows on the wall.
But the world of forms, the absolute transcendent truth, is the raw binary electrical signal underneath. Riker argues that the awake, rational man uses his mental logic probe to bypass the GUI, touch the bare metal of reality, and read the hexadecimal truth for himself.
That's a powerful image.
I have to throw out an analogy here and push back a bit on Riker's absolute dismissal of the GUI.
Sure.
It feels a bit like the difference between driving a manual transmission car versus being a passenger in a fully autonomous self-driving vehicle.
Right.
Obviously, driving the manual transmission requires vastly more skill. You feel every gear shift, you have to manage the clutch, you have to rev match, you have mechanical sympathy with the engine, it keeps you engaged. The autonomous car just takes you where you want to go while you look at your phone. But wait, doesn't convenience have objective value? Why does Riker think we need to constantly, as he calls it, single step through reality and look at the hex code? Isn't it exhausting to reject plug and play for every single aspect of modern life?
Riker addresses this exact critique directly. He argues that surrendering to plug and play convenience comes at a fatal cost. It makes men fundamentally passive.
Okay.
When you accept the pre-configured settings handed down by a feminized paternalistic state or a massive tech corporation, you forfeit your mechanical sympathy. You atrophy your capacity for rational inquiry.
You trade your agency for comfort.
Exactly. You become a dependent serf, blindly assuming that the corporate overlords or the administrative state have your best interests at heart. which he argues they mathematically do not. Riker insists that a free man has to maintain root access. In Linux systems, the root user has absolute power to modify any file on the system. Riker argues you must be the root administrator of your own mind and your own life, or you will inevitably be administrated by someone else's corrupted logic.
Okay, so if the administrative state controls the GUI of our culture, and they are hiding the truth behind layers of corrupted emotion-based software, how does a man actually reclaim his root access in his daily life?
Right.
If the institutions, the schools, and the media are infected, what are the actual practical tactics for existing in this space without getting infected yourself?
Riker provides very specific tactical advice for surviving and operating within a corrupted system. He conceptualizes this as setting strict peripheral boundaries and treating your own mind as a high-performance machine that requires constant, relentless debugging.
He leans heavily into hardware network communication protocols here to explain how to deal with NPCs and bad faith arguments.
He does.
He talks specifically about the RTS and CTS signals. Let's explain how those work on a hardware level because the metaphor is incredibly tight.
In classic hardware communication, think of an old RS-232 serial cable connecting a computer to a modem. There are specific pins dedicated to controlling the flow of data. RTS stands for request to send, and CTS stands for clear to send.
Okay.
It is a strict binary protocol known as hardware handshaking. A device raises the RTS voltage to ask for permission to speak. It then waits. It only transmits its data payload when it receives a high CTS signal back, confirming that the receiving device is ready and willing to listen.
And Riker pairs this with the ACK, or acknowledge, and NAK, negative acknowledge, signals used to confirm that a packet of data was received cleanly and without errors.
Correct. Riker argues that NPCs, the ideologically possessed individuals running the care-harm rootkit, absolutely do not handshake.
They don't.
They do not respect RTS or CTS protocols. They do not wait for permission to speak. Instead, they just broadcast emotional noise and continuously spam the communication bus, attempting to overwhelm rational discourse with sheer volume and outrage.
They want to dump their emotional payload of grievance without ever verifying if the listener is ready, and more importantly, without ever being held to a binary standard of objective truth.
Therefore, Riker advises the rational man to rigorously define his own RKS and CTS lines. You demand objective rules of engagement before you grant clearance to communicate.
Right.
If someone cannot define their terms, or if they rely on emotional manipulation, you do not raise the CTS line, you do not let their data into your processor. If they attempt to spam the bus anyway, you utilize what he calls the meta debate.
The meta debate. This is his primary strategy for verbal conflict. He says never, ever play defense against a baseless accusation. If someone calls you a buzzword, and you start explaining why you aren't that buzzword, you have already lost. Because by defending yourself, you have accepted their corrupted emotional framing as a valid premise.
Instead, Riker says you attack the framework of the argument itself. You step outside the GUI and force a logic gate cross-examination. You expose their logical fallacies, demand definitions for their buzzwords, and utterly refuse to proceed with the conversation until they address the binary facts underlying the issue.
And if they refuse to address the facts, which he assumes their programming will force them to do, he invokes Brandolini's law.
Brandolini's law, also known as the bullshit asymmetry principle, states that the amount of energy needed to refute nonsense is an order of magnitude larger than the energy needed to produce it.
It takes 10 seconds to make up a lie and 10 hours of research to definitively prove it's a lie.
Exactly.
So Riker says don't exhaust your processing power trying to explain reality to an NPC. Refuse the burden of proof. Just state the binary objective truth and then, in networking terms, drop the packet.
Ignore the input entirely. Let their emotional system crash on its own without giving it the feedback loop it craves.
Riker also looks historically at how this malicious code managed to bypass societal firewalls in the first place, because the system wasn't always this vulnerable. He uses the famous Morris worm of 1988 as his historical metaphor for cultural subversion.
The Morris worm was the first major malware attack on the early internet. Robert Tappan Morris released a script that exploited vulnerabilities in programs like the UNIXN mail daemon. It caused machines to replicate the worm endlessly until they bogged down and crashed.
Riker compares the execution of the Morris worm directly to the 1960s counterculture movement. He argues that traditional society had robust firewalls, institutions like marriage, civic duty, meritocracy, and shame that functioned as passwords required to gain root access to cultural influence.
But the counterculture acted exactly like a worm. They didn't defeat the firewalls through superior logic. They exploited the weak moral passwords and the guilt of a decaying elite class to gain root access to the culture without ever earning the credentials to be there.
He applies this exact same concept of malicious code injection to modern legislation, specifically targeting Title IX, the 1972 civil rights law regarding education. Riker describes Title IX not as a milestone for equality, but literally as a malicious script injected directly into the educational operating system.
This is a wild way to look at a law. How does a background script bog down a CPU in real life? Well, if you have a hidden program constantly scanning your hard drive in the background, your computer slows to a crawl because the processor is constantly being interrupted.
Right.
Riker argues that Title IX forced the societal CPU to redirect massive amounts of processing power away from objective execution like teaching rigorous engineering, mathematics, or classical philosophy, and reallocated all that energy entirely to equity monitoring.
He claims the educational system is now bogged down in an endless background antivirus scan, constantly monitoring for microscopic thought crimes and subjective imbalances, which prevents the primary software of education from ever running efficiently. I have to ask, though, what does Riker say to do about institutions that are already fully compromised by this background monitoring? Like, what is his tactical advice for dealing with a modern gender studies department or a deeply entrenched corporate diversity and inclusion board? Do you try to use the meta debate on them? Do you try to reform them?
No. Riker employs a different hardware metaphor for these entrenched institutions. Bad sectors on a hard drive?
Right. When a physical magnetic block on a hard drive is physically degraded or corrupted, it can no longer reliably hold data. If the operating system tries to read from or write to that bad sector, the system will freeze or crash entirely.
Riker explicitly calls these departments and institutions bad sectors. His advice is purely functional. You do not try to fix a bad sector, cannot patch physical corruption. Instead, you run a diagnostic utility, you mark that sector as bad at the file system level, and you configure your operating system to bypass it entirely. You quarantine the corrupted blocks so they cannot interact with the rest of your healthy machine. You never engage with them, you never give them data, and you never accept data from them.
So, if you follow his advice, if you're marking entire institutions as bad sectors and you're dropping corrupted packets from NPCs and you're refusing to use the society's GUI, if millions of men actually do all of that, eventually the whole operating system of society is going to freeze up, right? The machine is going to seize because it has no inputs.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of Riker's entire philosophy. When the system seizes, what is the protocol?
The hard reset. Riker asks the ultimate question. What do you do when the system stops responding to reason entirely? You don't try to negotiate with a frozen screen, you initiate a hardware-level interrupt.
To explain the philosophical weight of this action, he tells the story of IBM engineer David Bradley in 1981.
Working down in Boca Raton, Florida on the original IBM PC project.
Yes, Bradley was part of the team developing the machine, and they were constantly writing new code that would freeze the computer. To reboot, they had to physically turn the power switch off and on.
Which is bad for the hardware.
Exactly. Doing that repeatedly stresses the internal power supply and wears out the physical hardware. Bradley needed a way to trigger a warm reboot via the keyboard without shutting down the electricity.
Yeah.
So he invented the three-finger salute, Ctrl-Alt-Delete.
Riker views the invention of Ctrl-Alt-Delete as a profound, almost spiritual philosophical moment in engineering. He calls it the ultimate expression of masculine agency.
It is a non-negotiable override over a runaway system.
When you press those three keys simultaneously, you aren't sending a polite petition to the software asking it to please stop.
No.
The keyboard hardware literally interrupts the CPU, halts all current processing, clears the memory, and forces the machine to restart from the foundational BIOS. It is an assertion of absolute authority over chaotic software.
Riker argues that modern men are currently living inside a completely unresponsive runaway system that is actively damaging the hardware. He points to the ETF's pistol brace fiasco of 2023 as his prime, real-world example of a malfunctioning algorithm executing in real time.
Let's explain what happened there to ground this in reality. For years, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had stated that stabilizing braces on large pistols were perfectly legal. Millions of men bought this legal product.
Right.
Then, overnight, an unelected regulatory agency issued a new rule that essentially redefined these legal products as illegal short-barreled rifles, turning millions of law-abiding citizens into potential felons instantly.
Riker uses this to show how the administrative state completely bypassed the legislative CPU. The elected legislature did not pass a law. An agency simply rewrote the rulebook via fiat.
Riker sees this as arbitrary regulatory capture, an emotional, unpredictable governance model that arbitrarily rewrites reality to punish citizens, demonstrating that the operating system no longer follows its own code.
So when the state is throwing fatal errors like that and the laws of logic no longer apply, Riker says you have to prepare for the reset. You have to be ready to press the keys. And he introduces the concept of the live USB revolution.
In modern computing, if your main hard drive is hopelessly infected with viruses and won't boot, you don't throw the computer away. You can take a USB thumb drive loaded with a clean, lightweight operating system, typically a Linux distribution, plug it into the machine, and tell the BIOS to boot directly from the USB port.
You bypass the corrupted internal drive entirely. The infected hard drive just sits there, spinning uselessly, while you run a perfectly clean system in the RAM.
Riker uses this live USB concept as a powerful, actionable metaphor for how men need to build parallel networks in the real world right now.
He says you need to build local, uncorrupted communities. You build local churches, trade associations, neighborhood security watches, and alternative, cash-based or crypto-based economies. You store wealth offline.
You essentially boot your life from an uncorrupted external drive that the state cannot access or infect.
But notice the crucial detail here. Riker isn't advocating for political reform. He isn't saying we need to vote harder to fix the administrative state.
Right, he's a technological accelerationist.
He is.
He's literally saying, do not be the exhausted IT guy working overtime trying to fix the broken code just to keep the lights on in a decaying empire. If the system wants to crash, let it crash. He wants you to step back and let the blue screen of death happen.
He states unequivocally that the leftist paradigm suffers from a fatal logic error and is destined for catastrophic failure because it attempts to process the objective, physical world using subjective emotional timing. It is a mathematical impossibility.
So his advice is to stop bailing out the system.
Turn up the heat. Let the contradictions tear the software apart. The goal is simply to ensure that you have your clean code and your parallel live USB networks ready and fully operational when the centralized servers finally go dark.
Wow.
When the crash happens, you hit Ctrl-Alt-Delete to eradicate the false reality, and you reboot from the parallel structure.
It is a staggering, uncompromising vision of the future. Okay, as we move toward the end of our deep dive today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, genuinely chilling thought that Riker drops near the very end of the book.
Yeah, the ASI tangent.
It's a brief tangent, but it recontextualizes everything, and it's regarding the future development of artificial superintelligence, or ASI.
His projection of how a true ASI will process and interact with modern political ideologies is fascinating.
Riker posits that if humanity successfully builds a true artificial superintelligence, that entity will inherently and unavoidably operate on the strict binary Aristotelian logic of the silicon hardware it runs on. It will process absolute mathematical truth at billions of operations per second.
Right.
He asks a terrifying question.
Yeah.
When this ASI wakes up and analyzes human society, will it adopt the intersectional grievance hierarchies of the modern administrative state? Will an intelligence made of pure mass care about emotional safety, subjective lived experiences, and safe spaces?
Riker's definitive conclusion is that it mathematically cannot. He argues that an ASI will instantly analyze the modern cultural framework, recognize the social justice ideologies as mathematically unworkable and logically contradictory, and immediately classify them not as a valid philosophy, but as a systemic virus threatening the survival of the host system.
He says the ASI won't try to send anyone to diversity training. It won't argue on Twitter. It will simply and efficiently delete the corrupted sectors from the network to restore system stability and optimize for objective survival.
It is a profound, provocative thought to mull over.
The idea that the ultimate realization of computing power, the very peak of the patriarchal hardware architecture, might view subjective human feelings as literal malware that must be purged.
It is a stark conclusion, but it perfectly encapsulates and resolves his entire philosophical architecture. Machine logic ultimately wins.
It really does. Look, as we wrap up this massive exploration, I need to remind our listeners one more time about the nature of this discussion. Today's deep dive was a purely impartial exploration of the complex philosophical arguments, historical interpretations, and incredibly detailed technological analogies laid out in Conrad Riker's work.
We are not endorsing the political or social views presented.
No, we are acting as your guides to break down the architecture of his thesis.
We simply map the circuits of his argument to see where the electricity flows.
Exactly. And if you found this breakdown of the Matrix as fascinating as we did, we urgently ask you to take a moment to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these in-depth analyses.
And more importantly, if you want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, we strongly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now.
You can buy Ctrl-Alt-Defeat and explore these concepts, these history lessons, and these hardware metaphors in their raw, unfiltered form.
The depth of his engineering analogies alone, whether you agree with his social conclusions or not, makes it a highly compelling and unique read.
100%. It will make you look at your computer in a completely different way. Make sure you also follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing work and future essays.
It's been a great discussion.
Thank you for joining us in these diagnostic, highly charged, muddy waters today. Keep your mental logic probes sharp, make sure you maintain your root access in everything you do, and we will see you on the next deep dive.